Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Meet the Expert event, which is part of a series of events hosted by the Buena Vista Museum. My name is Tony Rathburn. I'm associated with the museum. I'm also a professor at Cal State University, Bakersfield. It's my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. Anna Doty as tonight's Meet the Expert speaker. She will be talking with us about the wonders of bats, including a little bit about the ways that bats contribute to their ecosystems and how bats survive harsh environmental conditions. Dr. Doty received her bachelor's degree in conservation and resource studies from UC Berkeley. She then received her master's degree in zoology from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa and her PhD in zoology from the University of New England in Australia. She also did postdoctoral research at Arkansas State University. Dr. Doty is currently assistant professor of biology in California State University. Some interesting facts about Dr. Doty. She became interested in animal physiology while studying abroad in South Africa, where she learned about hibernation in small mammals. She chose bats as her study subject for her master's degree and has been hooked on bats ever since. Despite her international education, she can recite all 50 US states in alphabetical order, but we won't ask her to do that tonight. She became interested in animal physiology, and tonight she's going to be talking to us about bats. But before we get started, I'd like to let you know that if you like today's event, and if you'd like to see more content like this from the Buena Vista Museum, I would invite you to make a donation. You can make a donation to the museum anytime at buenavistamuseum.org/donate. Also, if you'd be so kind, please keep your devices muted. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat window. There's a chat button on your screen, so please just click that, type in your question, and we'll get to those at the end of the talk. During the presentation, we'll also be taking some polls, and if you would answer those in the chat, that would be very much appreciated. So keep a lookout for those. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Doty to tell us about the wonders of bats.
Thank you, Dr. Rathburn. So good evening. My name is Dr. Anna Doty, and today I really hope that I convince you that not only are bats beautiful and interesting creatures, but they are extremely important. Okay, so this picture right here, that's the background on this particular slide. These are 4 endangered gray bats. I took this photo inside of a cave, and as you can see, they are all best friends with each other, giving each other hugs. So we're starting on the right foot, right? Bats are friends. Okay, so, and before I get into some of our more factual content, I'm going to show you a really cool video. So we're pretty lucky in the United States to have the largest colony of bats in the entire world. So right here, you're going to see 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats that roost in this cave called Bracken Cave. It's kind of in between Austin and San Antonio in Texas. And they roost in this cave between March and October in the summer months. And this particular cave is owned by Bat Conservation International. I've visited this cave before. I was lucky enough to sit outside and witness this event. So these bats are emerging from this cave to feed. And I want you just to take a moment and imagine what that might be like. Okay, 20 million bats emerging at dusk to feed on insects. And here's a better image of what these bats look like. These are Mexican free-tailed bats, one of the fastest bats in the world as well. Okay, so, you know, I understand there are a lot of preconceived notions that people have about bats. So, you know, and I'd like to begin this talk by acknowledging that many people, maybe even some of you, are perhaps frightened of bats in some capacity. Maybe you've heard a story about, a bat attacking a person, or maybe your grandmother told you about a time a bat flew into her house and was trying to get in her hair or something, and she was very scared, right? So some of the words that people use to describe bats to me typically include words like scary, creepy, spooky, or bloodthirsty. And they have this image in their mind of something like this picture right here of a bat that looks like it's about to attack, right? But at the end of this talk, I hope you will use some different words to describe bats. And these words hopefully will include something like important, interesting, maybe even cute, helpful, and valuable. Look at this bat right here. That looks nothing like the bat from the previous slide, right? This bat is adorable. It's a Gould's long-eared bat from Australia. These bats are kind of just a big pile of fluff and cuteness, and I worked on them during my PhD, and I love them very much. They're very cute. Okay, so bats have been around for a really long time. They've been around for about 50 to 60 million years. But there has been a bit of a debate between scientists on how they evolved. We're still kind of trying to figure that out. In 2008, some scientists found a fossil that was dated to be over 52 million years old. And research actually shows that this particular bat evolved to fly before it could actually echolocate. And this is an Onychornicterus right here. That's what they call this bat. And it actually lived in an area that is current day Wyoming, so not too far from us, right? And it occurred in Wyoming during the Eocene period about 52.5 million years ago. So bats actually comprise the second largest order of mammals in the world after rodents. Okay, these are bats, and here are your rodents. So an order is just a taxonomic rank, and all bats belong to the order Chiroptera, just like all rodents, belong to the order Rodentia. The word Chiroptera in Latin actually means winged hands. So makes sense, right? And modern genetic evidence kind of places bats in this superorder called Loriciatheria right here. Loriciatheria is just a really large superorder of 6 orders that include moles and shrews and hedgehogs. Of course, the very successful bat radiation. It also includes carnivores and ungulates and even whales. So it's pretty interesting what bats are related to. So that brings me to our first quiz question. So I want to ask you, we had some technical difficulties actually launching the poll. So what I would appreciate is if you could answer in the chat what letter you think corresponds to the correct answer. I would really appreciate that. So our first question is, how many species of bats are there in the world? Do you think it's 350, 500, 950, or 1,400? And I'll give everyone kind of a chance to answer that, and then I'll tell you what the real answer is. Okay, seeing a diverse set of answers here, which is great. Okay, awesome. I love the participation. It fuels me. Keep it going. All right, so how many species of bats are there in the world? So the answer to this is actually 1,400. There are 1,400 species of bats in the world. And now that you know there are so many species, we can kind of talk about where they occur. And you might not know it, but bats are extremely common. They're all around us. They're all around us here in Bakersfield too. And bats are among one of the most diverse group of mammals, and they exist on every continent except Antarctica, and they inhabit almost every type of habitat on Earth. There are like a few very isolated islands out there that bats haven't gotten to. And so bats make up 20% of all mammal species, and they fill many niches in the ecosystems that they live. What I mean when I say that is they have many different roles that they fit into in the different ecosystems where they live. So we can see here, there are lots of different looking bats, and I'm going to show you a whole bunch of them right now. Okay, so there is also a lot of debate about what I'm also going to tell you, because we still are trying to figure out how bats evolved, right? But for simplicity, I'm going to introduce what we call two suborders of bats. So we have the order Chiroptera, and then there are two suborders from Chiroptera. And these suborders were determined by genetic analysis. Originally, all bats that were small were called microbats, and all bats that were big were called megabats. A very easy distinction to make. But they actually kind of found out that wasn't the correct way to do things. And surprisingly, some of the smaller bats, which eat bugs, those were originally called microbats. Some of them are actually more closely related to the larger fruit bats. And these bats are going to make up a new suborder classification called the Jangochoroptera. And the Jangochoroptera is comprised of 7 families made up of 415 species. And I'll show you a representative of each of these families now. So first, we have the Crasionycteridae. This is a Kitty's hognose bat. It's the only bat which actually comprises this family. Very cute, very tiny, right? Then we have the Hippocidaridae. These are the old world leaf-nosed bats. You can see already the variation, right, in these bats right here. We have the Megadermatidae, which are the false vampire bats. The very popular Pteropodidae. These are the typical megabats that we think about, the fruit-eating bats. These are the bats you typically see on Facebook wrapped in little blankets eating watermelon and bananas, right? These are very popular bats visually that we see in social media, things like that. Then we have the Rhinolophidae. These are horseshoe bats. The Rhinonycteridae also have very cool leaf noses, nose leaves rather. And to get ahead of this, these leaves that you see on the noses of some of these bats, we think that it's probably mostly for increased echolocation abilities to receive signal, but we're not totally sure about that. Okay, and then lastly, we have our mouse-tailed bats. These are the Rhinopomatidae. Now, let's move on to our second suborder. We have the Jangochoroptera. And the Jangochoroptera is mostly made up of smaller bats. So it's comprised of 14 families and 1,034 species. So the first family that I'll mention is the Emballonuridae, which are the sac-winged bats. And they're really interesting bats because, as the common name, the sac-winged bats, indicates, many of these species also possess these sac-shaped glands on their wings, and these release pheromones to attract mates. The sac-winged bats can be pretty potent, I'll tell you that. Then we have the Pteropteridae. These are the smoky bats, and these are really interesting bats because they actually have functionless thumbs. So this is where the thumb is typically located on bats, right up here. And their thumbs are actually completely enclosed by their wing membranes, and they have these funnel-shaped ears. We have the Miniopteridae. I love these bats too. They're the bent-winged bats. The Molossidea, which are the free-tailed bats. This is an example of the bat that I showed you on the first slide. The Mexican free-tailed bat is a molossid bat. We have the Mormoapidae, which are the ghost-faced bats. These ones are pretty cool looking as well. The Mystocynidae, which are the New Zealand short-tailed bats. Then we have the Misopodidae. These are called sucker-footed bats. And these bats are named obviously for the little suction cups that they have on their feet, on their wrists and ankles rather. So what these bats do is they roost on the inside of rolled leaves on this plant called a traveler's tree. And they use the little suckers to attach themselves to the smooth surface of these leaves. And despite the name, they actually don't use suction to attach themselves to these leaves, but they use a form of wet adhesion. So they secrete a body fluid, which creates an adhesive capability for them to stick themselves to the leaves. Then we have the Natalidae, which are funnel-eared bats. The very popular bulldog bats, these bats actually will fish. These are the Noctilionidae. Then we have the Nycteridae, the hollow-faced bats. Another very popular type of bat, the Phylostomidae. These are the leaf-nosed bats. Okay, then we have another type of disc-winged bat here. They're very similar. This is the Thyropteridae. They're very similar to the Misopodidae that I mentioned earlier. And then we have, well, there's another family that I don't have a picture for called the Cistugidae. They're winged bats. I couldn't find a good photo for you. And then lastly, we have the Vespertilionidae. These are the Vesper bats. There are many, many, many kinds of Vesper bats. And right here, this is a hoary bat. And this is a very large insect-eating bat that lives all throughout North America, even around this area sometimes. Okay, now that you have all of those memorized, we can move on. So let's talk about the smallest bat in the world. This is the Kitti's hognose bat. This bat's also referred to as the bumblebee bat. You can see just how teeny tiny it is. That is someone's thumb, right? It's a near threatened species. And again, it's the only member of the family Crasionycteridae. This bat occurs in Western Thailand and Southeast Myanmar. It lives in limestone caves along rivers. So the Kitti's hognose bat is the smallest species of bat, like I said, but it's arguably also the world's smallest mammal. And I say arguably because there's another mammal called the Etruscan shrew, which is also very small, and it depends on which way you're measuring or if you're going by mass. So the Kitti's hognose bat is about 1.1 to 1.3 inches in length, and it weighs only 2 grams. So this bat eats insects, so we call this bat an insectivorous bat. And that's in stark contrast to one of the world's largest bats. This is the giant golden-crowned flying fox, the Acerodon jubatus. This is a species of bat that is from the Philippines. And this bat mostly eats figs, so we call this bat frugivorous. And this bat weighs up to 3.1 pounds, and the wingspan can be over 5.5 feet. That's huge. I've never seen a bat that big myself, but one day, hopefully. And as of 2016, the golden-crowned flying fox was listed as endangered because its population declined by more than 50% over a 20-year time period between, I believe, 86 and 2016. And so one of the reasons it declined so much is because it's hunted for bushmeat quite commonly. And the reason why it's hunted for bushmeat over other animals is because it's simply very large, right? So it's a really easy target. So they're very commonly hunted. So there are other bats like the large flying fox and the Indian flying fox that have similar weights and comparable wingspans. So those bats are also often considered to be one of the world's largest bats as well. Okay. Now, I'd like to show you some of the different bats that we can actually find in our area here in California and Kern County. I'll show you a few bats that myself and my graduate students caught this summer in Sequoia National Park. So the first one we have, this is a pallid bat. In this area, we also have the Townsend's big-eared bat. These are very sensitive species. You can see, obviously, it's called a big-eared bat because it has what? Big ears, right? Then we have, this is the only picture I have of, so excuse my face, but this is the only picture that I have of a big brown bat. There are also little brown bats, by the way, very creative names. This is the big one, and there's a little one too. Okay, this is a California myotis. This is a long-eared myotis. Obviously, its ears are very, very long. And then lastly, we have the canyon bat. This isn't an exhaustive list. It's just all the bats that I happen to have pictures for that I caught over the summer. So canyon bats are very small as well. They're super cute. So a common myth about bats is that they're blind. And it really is a myth that bats are blind. Some bats actually have better vision than we do. Like some of those larger fruit bats, they not only can see in the day, but they can see really well at night as well. Some bats don't have as good of vision as we do, but they're not blind. Sometimes it's a little bit rudimentary, but they certainly are not blind. And although bats have relatively good eyesight, most are going to depend on their very well-developed echolocation system to navigate and capture insects in the dark. So to detect obstacles and prey in their environment, bats will emit a series of ultrasounds, which are very high-pitched sounds beyond the range of our hearing. And as a bat flies and calls, it listens to the return of those echoes, and it kind of builds up a sonic image of its surroundings. So bats can tell how far away something is by how long it takes the sound to return to them. They can also tell how big a target is based on the strength of the returning signal. And they can also tell what shape the target is based on the spectral pattern of those returning sound waves. And many bats emit pulses of these high frequency sounds at a rate of sometimes a few to sometimes 200 per second. That's a lot of calls in a second. So that allows bats to capture these teeny tiny flying insects, even in complete darkness. And the interesting thing is that echolocation calls are actually really, really loud. If we could hear the echolocation calls of bats, it would be comparable to the noise from a train. So what bats do is they have, because of this, bats actually have a muscular mechanism that enables them to deafen themselves while they are sending out calls so they don't harm their own hearing. So the human voice, we create sound waves between about 125 and 210 hertz. Bats can generate echolocation calls between 15,000 and 150,000 hertz. So as a result, the echolocation calls of bats are, again, too high pitched to be perceptible by us. And using echolocation, these bats are going to be able to detect objects as thin as a human hair up to 10 meters away in complete darkness. And again, that's going to be very useful for them because they hunt these really small flying insects. And echolocation calls can be used to actually differentiate species of bats. So the characteristics of the calls that are emitted by different species of bats can really differ quite a bit. So in fact, making recordings of bat calls here is an important way to determine what kinds of bats are living in a certain area. So this is a very common mechanism that we use to kind of see what's out there. So in order to do this, we need to use these ultrasonic detectors. And the bat detectors will record the echolocation calls and put them into an audible range that we can hear. And we'll also be able to visualize those calls using a sonogram. So then these recorded calls can be characterized by their duration, how frequently they're calling, and the shape of the call. You can see how different the shapes of each of these calls are. And that's how we can identify the species that made the call. So when a bat captures an insect, the calls are going to differ in feeding steps, which include the search phase, and then the detection, and then the approach and the feeding buzz, so the attack. So we have search and detection, approach, and then the attack. So when bats attack prey, they actually make what we call a feeding buzz. That's a sequence of continuous calls of short duration. You can tell that these are kind of getting closer and closer together. So let's listen to a couple of bat calls here. The first one, well, both of these are actually from a pipistrelle bat in the United Kingdom. So you might want to have your volume all the way up for this because it's a little bit soft. So I urge you to kind of turn the volume up on your computer. So if you listen really closely, and the first one, it takes a while, but as this bat approaches its target, it needs to update its position, the position of the information kind of more frequently. So what it will do is it will shorten the interval between its echolocation pulses. So at the very end of this, you'll be able to hear the characteristic buzz as that bat homes in on its prey. So it kind of occurs towards the end. So again, I urge you to kind of turn up the volume so you can hear this. So hopefully you were able to hear that towards the end of that audio clip. There was a bit of a buzz. That's when the bat actually homed in on its prey and was trying to figure out exactly what it is, the shape, where it is, and then be able to attack it. I have another quick feeding buzz I can play for you again. Okay, so you hear that little buzz towards the end. Hopefully you're able to hear that. So that's what the bat calls sound like. They're searching, and then you heard the call kind of get closer in duration, and then they had the buzz at the end. Okay, let's do another poll here. So we know that there's lots of bats out there, right? And they eat all sorts of stuff. And I want to know what you think the majority of bat species eat. Do you think it's blood, or fish, or insects, or mammals? I think you all are onto something. Great. Okay. I think that we have a consensus here. I think it seems like everyone feels like the answer is C, insects, which is correct. However, bats will also eat all of these things as well, just not nearly as much as they do eat insects. And I'm going to talk about all this in just a moment. So let's talk about insects and relatives first. So again, most bats are insectivorous. That means they eat insects. Common prey items for these insectivorous bats are going to include the most common items are typically moths and beetles. That doesn't make for a great picture though, so I chose some of the less common items. They'll sometimes eat things like crickets or centipedes, even caddisflies or different diptera or flies. They'll eat lots of those aquatic insects if they're, foraging above some type of still body of water. This is a pallid bat. I already showed you the pallid bat. Pallid bats eat scorpions. So they're pretty cool. They really have no fear. Pallid bats often have lots of scars all over their wings and their muzzle from kind of bashing around, and they swoop on the ground and they'll pick up a scorpion. They have absolutely no fear. They're pretty cool creatures. So bats will even eat scorpions. And of course, bats eat fruit. So while most species of bats in the US and Canada are insectivorous, bats in other parts of the world feed on a variety of items in addition to insects. Many species, including flying foxes, are going to feed primarily on fruit. And much of the fruit consumed by fruit-eating species is very, very ripe. So there's this myth that bats are just out there ruining crops of, trees of fruit full of mangoes, but really bats are going to target the fruit that's overly ripe that we don't want anyway. So they're really not actually a problem for fruit growers. In fact, fruit bats perform an extremely important function as seed dispersers, and many plants depend on bats to scatter their seeds. And a really good example of that is figs. So figs are really, really easy targets for bats, and they swoop in, they snatch up one of these figs, then they perch elsewhere, they carry it away, they perch elsewhere, and then they devour the pulp of that fruit. And the seeds are going to end up on the ground in one of two ways. The bats are either going to spit them out, or the seeds will move through the bat and be deposited through their guano. And in fact, it's really important for some seeds to go through the digestive tract of bats, and it's more probable that something will grow from that seed if they actually move through the digestive tract of a bat. So bats like this often like really open areas, so they're really important for reforesting sites where species like figs will readily colonize. So this is a Wahlberg's epauletted fruit bat. I don't know what it's eating, but it's clearly happy about it, right? Then this is a minor epauletted fruit bat from Kenya. It's carrying a fig. And this is a Peter's dwarf epauletted fruit bat. So lots of fruit bats eat things like figs. They'll also eat bananas, all sorts of stuff. So again, they're very important dispersers of seeds. So other bats will feed on nectar and pollen, and nectar feeding bats are also really important because they're pollinators, and many plants will depend almost entirely on bats for pollination. This is a Mexican long-tongued bat. It's found in the southwestern US and also most of Mexico, as well as El Salvador and Honduras, I believe. So it lives in a variety of habitats, but it's really common in semi-arid and desert environments. And this species is going to feed on nectar and pollen from agaves as well as other plants. So what's really interesting about this bat is its tongue can extend to up to a third of its own body length, and that makes it really uniquely adapted to reach the nectar that's deep inside a cactus blossom or an agave. So we call the Mexican long-tongued bat a keystone species because we need the Mexican long-tongued bats to help pollinate various plants and cacti within their particular environments. We have to have them. And these bats are very much threatened or endangered. There's different species of these long-tongued bats, and pretty much all of them are in peril. And the Mexican long-tongued bat is going to pollinate and disperse seeds for about 60 species of agave plants. So why is the agave plant important? Well, the agave plant is the base ingredient of tequila. So if I haven't convinced you yet and you're a fan of tequila, then therefore conserving bats conserves your ability to have tequila. Okay, so we need bats so that you can have tequila. So hopefully I sold you on that one if you're a fan. If not, so what? We still need agave plants. So, okay, and then bats will also eat animals like fish. They have these special, you see how big their feet are? They have these special feet with these sharp and curved claws here. They'll skim along the surface of a body of water and they'll catch the fish that are the small fish at the surface, usually minnows or something like that. Some bats will even eat mice. This is a ghost bat right here. It lives in northern Australia. They're very cool animals. Bats will even eat frogs. In fact, this bat is called a frog-eating bat because it does what? It eats frogs. So this bat is native to Central and South America. Okay, and last but not least, I will talk about the vampire bats. So the most famous or infamous among the bats are the 3 species of vampire bats. These bats are only found in Mexico, Central America, and South America. So don't fear, they don't occur around here. And these bats feed on the blood of warm-blooded animals, and the vampire bats will obtain blood by biting their prey They have these very sharp incisor teeth, and then they lap the blood as it flows from the wound. Most animals have no idea they've even been bitten. It's very common, you know, for these bats just kind of take what they need and then they go along their way and it's fine. So one interesting thing about vampire bats though, first of all, I don't believe personally this space is scary at all, but vampire bats are really cool because they form really strong bonds with other members of their colony. And they have this really unique adaptation where this is not common among other bats, but for vampire bats, this is common. They will share food with each other. So vampire bats can only survive about 2 days without feeding. But that doesn't mean that they can necessarily find food every single night, right? So that poses a problem. So when a bat fails to find food, it will often beg another vampire bat for food, and that bat will be a donor. So there's a donor bat that will regurgitate a small amount of blood to sustain other members of the colony. So it's a great example of reciprocal altruism and sociality among vampire bats. They're really intelligent, really social animals, and absolutely need to be respected. So they're very, very cool. Another question that one might ask is, where do bats actually live, right? So many people think bats live in caves, and that's true. Bats absolutely do live in caves. I'll play a video for you right here. I took this video, these are the endangered gray bats, and I took this video in a cave when I was doing a cave survey at one point. So look how many there are. There's so many. I believe there were 500,000 in this particular cave. So many bats also live in trees. They can live under the bark of a tree like this, or they can even live in the hollow of a tree.
Here's the antenna.
And there's the bat right there. And that bat is questioning how we found him. And I'll explain to you how we did that later. But that's a California myotis that we found living under the bark of a tree in Sequoia National Park this summer. And that video was taken by my field technician, Conrad Lucas. So bats also will live in places like inside of buildings, and they will also live under bridges. And this image here is from the Congress Avenue Bridge in Austin, where more of those Mexican free-tailed bats live in the summertime. All right. So our next quiz question, what is the estimated monetary value that bats provide to ecosystems through their control of pest insects? So bats help control populations of insects that we consider pests. How much money do you think they save farmers per year? You can put your guess in the chat window. Okay, we have a diverse set of answers on this one. I'll wait for a few more people to make a wager here. All right, so scientists estimate that insectivorous bats save farmers in the United States only roughly $23 billion per year by reducing crop damage and limiting the need for pesticides. It's amazing, $23 billion per year. So that's because most bats, there's a lot of bats out there, right? Way more bats than you think are out there. And most bats can eat up to half their body weight in insects every single night. And then bats that are pregnant or nursing are going to consume up to 100% of their body weight every single night. So the millions of Mexican free-tailed bats at that Bracken Cave in Central Texas, they actually help target a particularly damaging pest called the corn earworm moth. That's also known as the cotton bollworm, the tomato fruit worm. And that pest attacks a host of different commercial plants ranging from artichokes to watermelons. So imagine all those 20 million bats performing that ecosystem service every single night. And then we talked a little bit about seed dispersal and pollination already. And just to touch on pollination again, most flowering plants can't produce seeds and fruit without pollination, right? So when bats are feeding on nectar, they pick up that pollen and move it between the stamen to the pistil of the flower. And so their role as pollinators is very critical for a wide variety of plants like the cacti and the agave, which I mentioned. So what are some threats to bats? Well, the top three are going to be climate change, habitat destruction, and white nose syndrome. So global climate change is a major threat to bats. And some of the major threats that climate change poses to populations of bats include increased severity and frequency of fires like we now have in California and also in Australia. Bats will die due to extreme weather events like heat waves. These are a bunch of dead fruit bats that just completely went kaput after a major heat wave in Australia. So they're all on the ground. They can't handle these heat waves. Okay, they don't get to go inside and have air conditioning, right? These bats can't handle it at all and they just die. Okay, then there's going to be increased aridity in some areas, increased instances of drought, and that's going to reduce survival and reproductive success of bats because there's going to be less water available. Climate change can also cause shifts in the migratory periods of bats, and that can really cause a major mismatch between the timing of food availability and resources during these really important life stages of bats like reproduction. Then habitat destruction is the most serious peril for bats worldwide. Forest habitat, which many bats are going to use for roosting and foraging, are disappearing at an alarming rate due to timber harvest, clearings for farm crops, mining operations, cattle pastures, making cities. And that's going to be even more dangerous and significant in those tropical rainforests, which are home to a huge diversity of bat species. And caves and abandoned mines also are important roosts for bats, with countless numbers of bats being driven out due to, inappropriate guano mining. It really does happen. And then also thoughtless tourism. If you go into a cave in winter and you are potentially disrupting a huge colony of bats and you can kill them. So be careful when you go out exploring, right? And then last, we have white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome is a fungal disease that has been continually responsible in the United States for the death of millions of bats since it was first discovered in 2006 in New York. This white nose syndrome, you can see this is the fungus right here. This condition is causing massive population declines for the last 15 years, and it's named for this telltale white fuzzy growth that you see on the nose and the ears of bats, as well as their wings. I'll get to that more in just a second. I realize I'm already running out of time though. Okay, let's do our next question. How do bats survive the cold months if they do not migrate south to find food? Do you think that they fly, hibernate, swim, or grow fur? Put your answer in the chat. Okay, looks like most people are kind of on the same page here. So most people are saying B, hibernate, and that's true. I'm very excited that that was the overall guess. So when most people think of hibernation, they're thinking about bears kind of hunkering down for the winter, but bears are not a good example of a hibernator. Okay, we're throwing that example out. You can use bats from now on as our example for a hibernator. There are many other animals that hibernate as well, all over the world actually. And insectivorous bats are often going to hibernate in winter if they don't migrate to warmer areas. So what actually is hibernation? Well, we as humans, we have a constant body temperature. You can see here, we have a constant body temperature. That's great for us because that means we can be active all the time. But it's also a challenge because maintaining that constant body temperature is going to take up a lot of energy. And when we use a lot of energy, what do we have to do? We have to eat a lot. So for bats, food isn't exactly plentiful in the wintertime for insectivorous bats. You might notice that during winter, you don't often see a lot of bugs flying around. So that means there's not a lot of food for bats. So to save energy, bats and some other animals allow their body temperature to drop, okay, to very, very low levels for long periods of time in the winter. If it's for a long period of time, we call it hibernation. And then as you can see here, for a short period of time, we call that torpor. Okay, so doing that is important because it allows bats to save energy. Having a high body temperature requires a lot of energy, but having a low body temperature requires less energy. So that's what hibernation is. Sometimes animals will kind of warm themselves up periodically through winter to go do things like urinate or find water, or if it's a particularly warm day, they'll go find some insects. So this is actually what I mostly study, hibernation and torpor in bats. That's kind of my jam. Let's go back to white nose syndrome quickly, now that we understand hibernation. Okay, so now that we understand hibernation, I want to kind of explain white nose syndrome again. So white nose syndrome is caused by a fungus called Pseudogymnoascus destructans, and we know it as a psychrophilic fungus. The word psychrophilic means cold loving, so the fungus thrives in cold environments. That's a recipe for disaster for bats that hibernate in winter. Bats have to rely on their fat stores all through the winter. So when this fungus grows on their wings and on their muzzle, it really irritates them. And then they use up a bunch of energy reworming themselves from that low state of hibernation. And so then when they reworm themselves, they end up using all their fat stores and they starve to death. So that's how the fungus kills them. This is a map of the spread of white nose syndrome since 2006. It started in New York and then it spread out and then west. And in fact, we even have found it in California recently. So many of us that are involved in bat biology have been studying white nose syndrome to try and monitor that situation, figure out a way to reduce its impact on bat populations. It's a very big deal because it's caused collapses of certain bat populations by up to 99%. Again, that's bad because it can result in the loss of those really important pest control services that bats provide. And we don't want that, right? So how do I study bats? A couple of things that I do. Well, first to study bats, you have to catch them. So we use these large nets here called mist nets. They're made of a very fine material. They're so fine that sometimes the bats don't even know they're there and they'll fly into them. This net actually is kind of up. You pull it all the way down. It looks a bit like a fishing net, but it's much finer than that. So you just wait for them to fly into the net. Here I am getting a bat out of one of those nets. So we take the bats out of the net. And then what do I do with them? Well, I put these small devices on the bats called radio transmitters on their back. And these devices allow us to follow the bat around and find exactly where it is. To do this, we use antennas called Yagi antennas, okay, so we can track them. So in fact, these radio transmitters that I use are temperature sensitive. That means when it's warmer, it beeps faster. When it's colder, it beeps more slowly. And I can kind of use that information to figure out the body temperature of this bat. And then I can determine whether it's in hibernation or torpor or not. So after we adhere the radio transmitter to the bat, we release it and it kind of flies off into the night. And then the next morning we go and try to find it. So I can find out where the bat is roosting. I can find out its body temperature and make these really interesting conclusions based on where they're going and what they're doing. So here's a release video of one bat, a California myotis. Kind of doesn't want to go. There he goes. And then I have another one here, a slow-mo. it looks like it's falling, but it chose to do that, just so you know. So they just kind of fly off, they drop down, and then they fly off. All right. So common misconceptions about bats. The first one, we already busted that. Bats are not blind. We also know not all bats drink blood, right? Then our third one, only 3 species out of 1,400 bats actually drink blood. Bats intentionally fly into your hair. That's not true. Okay, so you don't have to. Bats will sometimes fly towards you, but they're not trying to touch you. I promise you. I've never had a bat fly in my hair, and I've been around millions of bats at once. Never once has a bat come anywhere near my hair. So that's a very common misconception I hear all the time. So don't worry, they won't get tangled in your hair. Lastly, all bats have rabies, not more than other animals that get rabies. So you don't have to be particularly concerned about bats. Yes, there's a risk involved, but other animals get rabies too, like raccoons, right? So less than 1% of bats have rabies. It's really not common at all. Okay, so we think that they do because it's a biased sort of situation where we end up, if some bat is suspected to have rabies, then you send it in for testing. And so it seems like there's a higher percentage of them that do, but they really don't have rabies very often, less than 1% of bats. So if you see a bat on the ground, that's kind of a bad sign, right? But you don't really see bats on the ground very often. So not to worry, very few bats actually have rabies. Okay, now, our last content slide here. This is purely opinion, and I want you to tell me which bat you think is the coolest. The first is the Honduran white bat. They live in Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Western Panama. They're very cute. Lots of people love this bat. They cut along the veins of a leaf, and it collapses into a little tent. And then they kind of roost in the little leaf tent. So can shelter sometimes 1 bat, as many as 12 bats. This is the Chapin's free-tailed bat, has a really cool mohawk. So this is a development in the breeding males of this bat. It helps to disperse a scent that is released from the gland at the base of their head. These bats are from Central and Southern Africa. Then C, we have the wrinkle-faced bat. They think that these bats have wrinkly faces maybe to help with sonar, or they also think that maybe it helps channel juices as they're eating fruit, or maybe to attract females. This bat has a very powerful bite, which allows it to feed on really hard fruits or underripe fruit. So this is a special case here. These bats are found in Central America. Then we have lastly the hammer-headed bat. So these bats are completely harmless. They inhabit equatorial Africa. They feed on fruit. If you're wondering what's up with their faces, they have these large resonating chambers right here that produce really cool vocalizations to attract females. So this is a mating thing. Okay, so only the males of the hammer-headed bats look like this. So which one do you think is the coolest? Alex says all of the above. Hi, Alex. Cool to see you here. Charlene says all bats are beautiful. Thank you, Charlene. I'm glad so many people love all of them. Awesome. Val says E, the Mexican long-tongued bat. Well, that wasn't an option, Val, but I'll accept it. Okay, so all bats are cool, right? I just wanted to show you pictures of some of the weird and cool bats that are out there. That was just my excuse to do that. So there are many more goofy looking bats, cool looking bats, but these are just a few of them. And I just want to give a quick shout out to my really amazing graduate students who I really, really deeply value. I have my grad student Autumn Coro working on bats and fire, Jonathan Janes working on bats under bridges, and then Sochi who works on shrews actually. So thank you to my grad students for being so absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate you. And that's the end of my presentation. So thank you very much for coming.
Okay. Questions for Dr. Doty. If you would type them in the chat, that would be great. I have a couple to start with.
Okay.
What can we do as individuals to help bats?
I think the biggest thing that we can do is stop perpetuating a lot of the myths about bats and be very vocal about how wonderful bats are and how important they are. So in our day-to-day lives, I have a couple of things. First of all, this is a very controversial opinion, but it's actually true. If your cat goes outside, you let your cat out, cats kill bats. They eat a lot of bats. Outdoor cats are a big no-no. So I know people love to let their cats outside, but you honestly shouldn't do that. You need to keep your cat indoors, and that will help reduce bats are commonly eaten by cats. So keep your cat inside. Also, now that it's Halloween, one thing you can do, there's a couple of things in your immediate capabilities, that you can take control of. The biggest thing is be vocal about bats and how cool they are, and tell people they're not scary. We should appreciate them. Tell them that they are controllers of their seed dispersers, pollinators, control pest insects. And now that it's Halloween, a lot of people hang that cotton, the webbing up outside their house. Bats get caught in that and die, so don't use that. Glue traps that people put outside to catch insects, sticky traps, bats get caught in that and die, so don't use those either. Yeah, those are the top three I can think of off the top of my head.
Great, thanks. We've got some questions in the chat. So Kathy Barnett is asking, where have you seen bats around Bakersfield?
Oh, I saw them. I've seen them at my apartment complex flying overhead in the summertime. I suspect they're Mexican free-tailed bats. And if you go during the summer, you go on Truxton and you go to the Truxton Lake. I mean, I have seen hundreds of bats foraging above Truxton Lake right at dusk. You can see them. So if you want to see a good show, that's the best place that I suggest. I'm not sure if they're there now at dusk, but you can check it out. Definitely in the summertime though.
Our next question comes from Brooke, and the question is, do you think there is a lack of literature which paints bats in a positive light?
Well, published research, no, but like peer-reviewed research, there's a lot of peer-reviewed research about bats that promotes them. But yes, I think there are a lot of, it's not literature necessarily that I think is the problem. I think it's more like media, like images of bats, they're very synonymous with Halloween and being creepy. And so stuff like that kind of perpetuates the ill feelings towards bats. Books, sometimes I guess Dracula, so stuff like that. In movies, I think movies, TV are really, and pictures are where things go wrong. Mm-hmm.
Our next question comes from Luke Cotton, age 9. What is the longest a bat can fly?
Ooh, in terms of distance, some bats can fly over 100 miles in a single night. The really large fruit bats, they have these big, big, big wings, and they fly really high in the sky, and they fly really, really far to forage. They can go a really long distance. As for timing, I mean, they can really fly all night. I mean, if that's what they need to do, they can fly for a long time. The smaller bats can also fly for a long time as well. Some of them will forage all night long. They'll forage for 12 hours if they need to. Sometimes they'll take a rest in a tree or something like that, but sometimes they also won't do that. So they can fly far and they can fly for a long time.
And Elizabeth, 6 years old, says that bats are so cool. Thank you for the information.
Aw.
There's a number of comments like that. Mariah Martin asks, are there more bats than people?
Oh, I actually don't, I assume so. I actually don't know the estimated number of bats in the entire world. That is a really wonderful question, but I assume there are more bats than people. There are so many bats out there. I mean, so the answer is yes. There are colonies of millions of bats. For example, 20 million bats in one of those caves in Texas, there are huge numbers of bats, and there are bats everywhere all around us and all the trees around our houses. So the answer, I think, is yes.
Our next question comes from Charlene Murphy, who asks, do you have any recommended media literature for those of us that would like to learn more?
Yes. Actually, I have a book. This book is really good. Bats of the United States and Canada. This is a really good book. It's an identification book, but it also has a really, really great introductory section that tells you everything that you want to know about bats. This is a really, really good book. Bats of the United States and Canada. That's a good one to get started with, and then you can familiarize yourself with bats. In terms of, I think that's what I would recommend to start with. Yeah. Off the top of my head, my brain is vacant otherwise, but.
Alex Matthews asks, is there much known about how hibernation influences their immune system?
Yeah, so there is a suppression of the immune system during hibernation, just like because, in fact, bats have a very good immune system when they're flying around. We're actually kind of starting to research that a little bit more now. So bats have wonderful immune systems when they're flying around. They have high body temperatures when they're flying, and it helps kind of ward off some of those viruses and diseases that they might get. But during hibernation, they do have a suppressed immune system because when you have a low body temperature, you have a suppression of basically all of your physiological processes. Your kidney function is reduced, for example, your heart rate's reduced, you have less blood flow. So if you have less blood flow throughout your body because your heart rate is slower, then you're gonna have less delivery of things typically like antibodies and stuff like that. So yes, there is a suppressed immune system during hibernation. I wouldn't say that necessarily, I would think that the most information that we know about that is probably from the 13-line ground squirrel, but that's also a hibernator. But there's a lot more research on that particular hibernator in comparison to bats.
I have another one while we're waiting for more questions here. What is being done to mitigate the white nose syndrome?
Yeah, so we've been working on that for over 15 years now. There isn't a lot that we have been able to figure out. Basically, the best idea out there is to develop some type of spray that's like a vaccine that will kind of bolster their immune systems during the hibernation period, that you go into a cave and just kind of spray around. But it's a very dangerous thing to test, right? So I think everybody kind of just, we kind of don't step over the edge to actually do it. So not a lot to actually cure white nose syndrome, but in places where white nose syndrome is really rampant, you try to prevent people from going in the caves. People are huge spreaders of white nose syndrome. You walk into a cave, you step or touch something, or it gets in your hair, you get the fungus on your body somewhere, it's on the bottom of your shoes, you don't clean the bottom of your shoes, then you go into another cave, and all of a sudden that fungus colonizes in that new cave and then kills all the bats in that cave. So I would say completely avoiding caves in the winter is one thing that we try to get people to do.
We have another question, this one from Rich Ryan. Is the feeding buzz audible to humans?
Only for some species of bats. There are a few species of bats, like some of the molossid species or the Mormont species, they call at lower frequencies. And so there's only a few bats that you can actually hear. One bat I know off the top of my head is the spotted bat. You can actually hear the spotted bat calling and trying to feed as well. So only a select few bats. Most of them no, but a few of them you could potentially hear.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? If you're having trouble typing into the chat, just unmute yourself and ask your question. Okay, well, so I want to thank you very much, Dr. Doty, for your time and for sharing your knowledge tonight. The museum would love to have you back again, so expect an invitation in the future. And before we go, I'd like to mention again that if you enjoyed tonight's event, please consider making a donation at the buenavistamuseum.org/donate. Your generosity is what makes events like this possible. Thanks again for everyone for coming, and please keep an eye on the website for upcoming events. And also I would encourage you to check out the recorded Meet the Expert talks that are on the museum's website. Thanks again, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you for having me.